Great.
Yeah. It's an interest. This.
I think we can get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Annette Heuser, and I'm the Executive Director of the Bertelsmann Foundation here in town. And it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you to our debate today, Moving Out of the Crisis, Europe's Joint Response. And I'm very delighted that we also have our new board member with us this afternoon, Charles Delara, a household name here in town, until recently the head of the Institute of International Finance, and right now partner at the Partners Group. As you know, our plan was to bring together today the 5 key representatives of the Eurozone. And your counting is right. Actually, we have just 4 of them right now on stage, because unfortunately, Minister Dijsselbloem, the Dutch finance minister, who is also the president of the Eurogroup, had to cancel last minute. He's very sorry, but he has urgent government business in The Hague. But the good news is that he is very confident that our 4 panelists and his 4 colleagues are also representing his views in the best possible way. As many of you know, we are hosting every year our annual financial conference before the IMF World Bank Spring meeting. So for us today, it's a very welcomed opportunity to have a discussion in between here at the autumn meetings, focusing in particular on the Eurozone. And I think it's a perfect timing right now to take stock where we are standing in the Eurozone crisis management, to ask our panelists what are the next steps that they will take when it comes to measures, institutions like the banking union that will be in place shortly to make the Eurozone more robust and more sustainable in the future. And of course, the honor and pleasure to introduce our panelists belongs to no one other than Zanny Minton-Beddoes. She is the economics editor of The Economist, and of course, many of you know that Zanny has all the qualities that you need to tame such a panel. And of course, I think we all deserve a kind of refreshment after our discussion today. So I'm delighted that we can co-host a reception with our friends from the European Investment Bank and Werner Hoyer, its president, afterwards. I know the weather is not perfect today. We actually discussed it up in the green room. It's like Brussels. When I started one of my jobs in Brussels, there was one golden rule that I learned very quickly, which is, regardless how bad the weather is, never miss a reception. So I hope in this respect, you can all join us later. So Zanny, over to you.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you very much. You have brought... Thank you. Welcome to this panel. It is Brussels weather, but I think it's probably the first time for a while that we can be quite sure that you're coming to a country or to a city where there's more of a crisis than there is that you've come from. So Europe is moving out of crisis with a joint response. You might offer some tips to your colleagues here. What I wanted to do in this panel, and it's a fantastic panel to do this, is to sort of assess really how well Europe is moving out of the crisis and what is happening next. And to do that, and I'm just going to go and start right here. You know everybody, but just for the record, Jörg Asmussen, member of the European Central Bank's Executive Board, Olli Rehn, EU Commissioner for Economic and Monetary Affairs, Werner Hoyer, President of the European Investment Bank, and last but absolutely not least, Klaus Regling, Managing Director of the European Stability Mechanism. And I think you're CEO of the EFSF too. Also, dual hat. So welcome to all of you. Let's start, Olli, with you. And why don't you give us an assessment of how confident you are that Europe has really turned the corner. You said, and I'm going to quote you now, you said recently that there are encouraging signs of recovery, but that complacency in policy and reforms posed a threat. So how confident are you of this recovery, and what is this complacency that you worry about?
Thanks, Zanny, and good afternoon to everybody. The European economy is indeed at a turning point for the moment. We are experiencing a subdued modest recovery this year, and we expect that it will be on a stronger footing in the course of next year, 2014. We also expect that forecast that there will be improved employment in the course of 2014. And what is interesting and important is that the composition of growth in Europe is improving in the sense that we have both net exports growing and we are witnessing a strengthening of domestic demand, which speaks in favor of sustainability of this growth. But at the same time, there is simply no room for complacency. We still need to do all we can to reinforce confidence. There are risks on the horizon. We see a weaker growth in the emerging market economies. And of course, we are concerned about the US budgetary situation, about the US fiscal gridlock. I know there has been some progress or some movement at least in the course of today. I just want to say that we support the efforts of the US policymakers and we hope that the spirit of responsibility and constructiveness will prevail as it has prevailed in Europe. Europe's policy mix, which is delivered by all the institutions here today, as well as all the member states individually and collectively, is supportive of sustainable growth and job creation. There are three particular challenges which I want to underline for the coming months. First is that it is essential to stay the course of reform in Europe, and in this we work in very close partnership with the member states, and we will review their fiscal policy and structural reforms by mid-November, whether they respect the recommendations that were given in the course of the summer. Second, we are preparing for successful exits from the support programs for Ireland in December and Spain in January. We are also supporting Portugal's efforts to complete its program next spring. And yes, there will be further important decisions ahead concerning Greece, where the economy is now stabilizing and reaching a turning point after an unprecedented adjustment. And third, we continue rebuilding the economic and monetary union. We've made already a quantum leap in economic governance. Currently, we are constructing a banking union by taking forward the legislative work for the single resolution mechanism and constructing the single supervisory mechanism. So, in a nutshell, this is all about modernizing and reforming Europe's economic and social model, not by somehow nostalgically clinging to the status quo, because that would only lead to a permanent economic decline of Europe, not dismantling the European model, because we believe in the combination of a stability culture, entrepreneurial drive, and social justice, but instead genuinely reforming and modernizing the Europe's social market economy for the sake of sustainable growth and job creation.
Let me just push you on that a little bit. In the quote that I cited you of, you said you worried about complacency. Is there a risk that now that the euro area is growing again, albeit not terribly fast, that you all become somewhat complacent and that this agenda that you describe doesn't progress as fast as it needs to?
You can take it as a preemptive strike, so that I want to avoid any complacency by talking it down beforehand. I don't see any sign of that yet, because I mean, let's be frank. The economic recovery in Europe or economic growth in Europe is not that strong that anybody reasonably could even think of could afford any kind of complacency in this situation.
Yeah, give me the central bank perspective on this. I mean, is this, all recessions eventually end, so is this simply the ending of a recession, or is this really the turnaround to a sustainable growth in the euro area?
I mean, these chairs are more fragile than the Economic and Monetary Union right now
This
is.
chair,
So.
yes, it is very fragile, actually.
Yeah.
But you're balancing very well on it.
That's what we are used to do, yes. Now, I mean, I can fully subscribe to what Ollie just has outlined. I mean, what we see that the incoming data are underpinning what our view is about the economic situation in the euro area. And we have this view in the central bank, let's say, since the end of last year. We have a very, very gradual recovery in the course of this year. This will improve further next year, but it's a slow recovery. It's a recovery that's positive. After 6 quarters, we are out of the recession in the euro area in the second quarter. That is both supported by export as well as by domestic demand. So I think we have made progress. And you can see this on a number of fronts. For example, the unemployment rate, it's 12%. That's unacceptably high. But the numbers, if you look at the details, the numbers of unemployed people is no longer rising since May this year. But we have a higher participation rate, and this leads to higher unemployment data. So if one looks a bit at the details, it shows that we are stabilizing, we are bottoming out, and it will further improve in our view in the next year, if we continue to do what we need to do, as Ollie rightly said.
Well, you laid out a long to-do list, and let's just focus on the first part of it, which I think is a very important one, that of the progress in the banking union, because financial fragmentation has clearly been a large part of the problem. And I'm going to come to the two of you in a second, but let me just stick with you since you are the ECB is a very important part of this. You, I think, Jörg, have said that banking overhaul is the third and maybe last chance to repair confidence in European banks. You have to get this right. You have to get this asset quality review right. How are you going to do it, and how are you going to make sure that it is done right and it's not another, squashed results that no one believes?
I mean, I think it's worthwhile, since we are on this side of the Atlantic, to see what is the US experience in dealing with, let's say, troubled banks, non-performing loans, bank balance sheets repair, whatsoever. I mean, the biggest difference from the US to Europe is nowadays that the US has federal institutions to deal with troubled banks. They have the FDIC that can wind down banks. They have the Fed that has done a credible stress test exercise and forced banks to recapitalize. They have the US Treasury that created TARP by providing guarantees. And for a second, one can make a thought example and think how things could have unfolded if, let's say, the state of California would have to deal with Wells Fargo on its own, or if the state of New York had to provide all the guarantees for Citibank instead of the US Treasury. And this is the situation that we have in Europe, that we have nations, member states, deal with banking crisis on their own. And this leads to a situation, if one sharpens this, that the taxpayer subsidizes banks implicitly in good times, explicitly in bad times, and it commits suicides in crisis times. And what we need in Europe is to create federal institutions that can prevent from local crisis becoming systemic. And here the answer is the banking union in all its elements. It's the supervision and the resolution. And you are right, before we start the European banking supervision at the ECB, we will directly supervise roughly 130 banks and banking groups that cover 85% of euro area bank assets. We will do a comprehensive balance sheet analysis, which will consist of 3 elements. This is a risk review of the portfolios, because it can differ in one country, it's ship financing, in the other, it's commercial real estate. Second, you have a bottom-up asset quality review, and based on this, you have a stress test that is more forward-looking. And this will end in one figure per bank in a possible recapitalization need. And you're right, I have said that for a number of reasons, and I'm not blaming any institution, for a number of reasons, 2 stress tests that we have done in Europe did not reach the aim to restore confidence in our banking sector. And this is why I think it's the third and the last chance for us to do this. And this is at specific interest, of course, to us, because we want to know which banks we are going to supervise, because the reputational risk in the future lies only with us. But secondly, what is more important, we are convinced that bank lending will only kickstart and reach levels to which we like to see it to support the recovery if we have made significant progress in repairing bank balance sheets. This is the real aim of the exercise.
And do you think, Klaus, you are potentially a backstop, or your institution is potentially a backstop player in this exercise, if there is a capital need and then the individual country needs an additional support? So you're watching this not completely from the outside. Are you confident that this third time around, the stress tests and this whole process can be done in a way that restores confidence? And what do you think your institution's role should be?
Well, I think it's reassuring that the ECB takes a very clear view here that this is a critical moment. We know there are all these rumors out in the market about potential gaps in bank capital. I think at ECB, and also my view, the result will be maybe not that bad. But it's very important to get a clear result, a transparent result that's credible, so that these rumors and suspicions disappear. And as Jörg explained, the ECB is fully aware of that, and therefore I think they will do everything necessary together with EBA, of course, the European Banking Authority, to have a credible exercise here. You said the potential role of the ESM, and the word potential is important because there are a few things we can do already now. There are a few things under discussion where the finance ministers of the Eurogroup have taken preliminary views, and then there are a few other elements that are not yet really discussed. What we could do today with banks is what we did in the case of Spain, restructure banks in a country by giving a loan to the government earmarked for the banking sector, but the relationship is with the government, with the authorities. So that's an instrument that has been used, it's available, could also be used in the future. We have discussed for some time, as you know, the possibility of direct bank recap. The Euro area finance ministers have agreed that this should become an instrument once the single supervisor is up and running. So that's in about a year from now. It still requires a unanimous decision of the Euro area finance ministers. So it's not legally speaking available yet, but the Euro area has made it clear that they want to create it. And then what is also more recently under discussion, whether the ESM should be a financial backstop to the single resolution mechanism and the single resolution fund. That instrument does not exist at the moment. We would have to change the ESM treaty to create it, not the EU treaty, but the ESM treaty. It's sometimes mixed up. That is a difficult process, but it's not quite as difficult as changing the EU treaty. So it's possible if there's the political will, but that would have to be decided. It does not exist yet.
Do you think
so
that would
these
be a
are
good
the
idea?
different possibilities.
Would that be a good idea to have that backstop, do you think?
Well, it depends what is needed in the overall framework. I think backstops in the end are needed, but we don't know what will happen exactly. We have the proposal from the European Commission to create a single resolution fund, which would build up over a 10-year period. There's no agreement yet. It has also to be discussed with the Council and the European Parliament. If this proposal became law, then obviously the funds would build up slowly. Initially, there would not be very much money. So a backstop would make a lot of sense. But even in the long run, like in the United States, the FDIC has a line of credit with the US Treasury, which has not been used very often. It's good to have it. It's a bit like OMT, good to have, but ideally never used. So I think that should, in the end, become part of the system.
What, your institution, the EMS now, you're there, you've just raised 5-year capital. You what do you imagine you will be doing in 5 years' time? I mean, there are so many potential tasks that have been assigned to you, and as you say, potential ones. Are you going to be a kind of European monetary fund, or are you going to be a much more integral part in terms of a backstop to the banking sector across Europe? Where do you see your institution going?
I've learned the last 3 years not to look ahead more than 1 year, so a 5-year time horizon is pretty long for me because I've learned that things move so quickly. I think the ESM, together with the EFSF, which continues to exist because it continues to finance the first 3 countries, Ireland, Portugal, and Greece, are very much part of the system that we have in Europe, and the different players have their very clear roles, the Commission, the ECB, and the ECB in 2 functions in the future. There has to be a single resolution mechanism somehow. We play our role on the financing side, and I think that is already a lot when you look back where we were 3 years ago. If you had asked somebody 3 years ago whether we would have all that in place and whether during these 3 years EFSF and ESM would have dispersed 210 billion euro to 5 countries, I don't think anybody would have believed that. And it's not only that we are dispersing that big amount of money, which is almost 3 times what the IMF has dispersed during that period. We are dispersing with conditionality, and we see the positive result. Conditionality works.
Are you suggesting the IMF is doing it without conditionality?
No, they also do it. So we learn from the IMF. We are applying the IMF system, but we do it in a different way because we have other institutions, and therefore we don't need a European monetary fund in the sense that one institution does everything that the IMF does globally. We have the Commission. I know how competent they are. I worked there for a while. They will continue to do forecasts and country analysis and conditionality. The ECB will be involved in that. ESM is very happy to continue to do the financing, be involved in the exercise, but we will not have one institution that does everything in Europe that the IMF does globally.
Now, Nahoya, you run an important European institution that is now playing an increasingly counter-cyclical role in this crisis, in the sense that you are helping to address the financial fragmentation a different way by increasing funds, particularly to try and counter the lack of access to financing by small and medium enterprises in crisis countries. Can you explain, because I suspect for many in the audience here, what you do or your institution does is perhaps less well known than what the other 3 do. So give us a sense first of the EIB's role in this. What are you actually trying to do? And from your perspective, is this progress to the banking union that we've had described proceeding successfully? And are there things that you, because you have a much more on-the-ground view, think need to be done to accelerate it?
Well, thank you very much. Of course, the EIB indeed is probably one of the least known EU institutions and one of the least known multilateral financiers, but we are the biggest one. So that's quite an unusual statement. The fact is that only during the crisis, after Lehman Brothers, the bank really came out of the shadow of the Luxembourg woods. It had grown considerably over more than 50 years there. And now that the crisis was there, the political leaders detected this as a very powerful instrument with a balance sheet of more than €500 billion. It's quite something to have in your hand in order to combat the crisis. Now, of course, we have to go to the causes of the crisis. You mentioned fragmentation of the markets, which brings us into a completely new dimension, or not completely new, but a new priority setting for the bank. When the bank was founded in the Treaty of Rome, nobody would have thought about short-term financing or relatively short-term financing for small companies and small tickets. At that time, the bank was founded for long-term tickets with long maturities and big volumes. So this has completely changed now because the need is there. In this very crisis, the bank has indeed turned from pro-cyclical to counter-cyclical with the help of the member states who granted us a considerable increase of the paid-in capital, which enables us to increase the volume very, very much by this year by 40% in 2013 and also over the next 2 years. So we can play a significant role in boosting the situation on the real markets. However, sometimes this instrument is a little bit overestimated, because what it boils down to right now, and you asked me about the banking union progress, it boils down to the question of confidence and trust. So although I have the easiest job among the 5 institutions that we normally represent, when Gerud can be here, who has difficult situation in Parliament today in The Hague, I'm responsible for growth, innovation, and deployment, so that's always positive. The others have to do the necessary reforms in the European Union, or to make sure that the banking system is working properly and things like that. Supervision, all these non-popular things need to be done as well. So we see this as one complex of measures, of set of instruments that need to be played together along one script, and that's what we're doing. This is why I believe that if the colleagues succeed in establishing more confidence in the banking system and in the economic development, then the role of the EIB can become less relevant, and that will be good for Europe.
It would be good for your role to be less relevant. So
yes, it is. I mean, then we are successful if the need to fill gaps which the commercial banks and other banks cannot fill is reduced. I don't foresee that coming, because in view of a potential upswing of the European economy, the demand for loans is going to be considerably increasing and not decreasing. And in view of the regulatory changes in the banking system, I think the credit crunch will not disappear. So there will be room for an institution which is at the same time an EU institution based on the EU treaty, and at the same time a very market-oriented institute which must fund on the international markets for almost $100 billion per year.
Can I turn to you again, Jörg, and I then ask you the same question? You made the comparison with the United States at the beginning of this conversation, and you said that there had been a cleanup of the balance sheets and a successful stress test. Another big contrast with the United States is that a much more debt has been written down. Deleveraging has progressed much further here, in part because of the mortgage foreclosure crisis, and a lot of debt was written down. Is it, an argument one frequently hears about Europe is that there is an underlying problem of too much debt and a debt overhang in the public sector, which gets you to the whole discussion about whether you need debt write-downs, and indeed in some countries in the private sector. Do you share that analysis? Do you think that there needs to be more aggressive deleveraging in Europe? And then what's the best way of doing it?
I mean, I would agree that in part of the bank balance sheet repair, the US was more forthcoming in writing off non-performing loans. They have written off, since 2008, $700 billion in NPLs. There are remaining roughly 300, for which 60% they have made provisions for. So this is a huge step forward. And we are a little bit lacking here in Europe, where, for example, up to now, we don't have a joint definition what a non-performing loan is. So the EBA is working on this, will come out later this fall with a suggestion. But this is something where we need to do things. Where I tend a bit to disagree is on the public debt, because I think here in Europe we have come quite far. We will reach, as a euro area as a whole, a primary surplus next year. And what is more important for me is when we look at the debt level. I mean, the debt level for the euro area is 96% of GDP, data for this year. For the US, the equivalent number is 107. And for Japan, it's 247. So I think we have gone quite a way in returning to a sound fiscal position. We need to continue to do this. So fiscal consolidation will stay on the agenda for the next years to come. Because, for example, we have only 5 countries in the euro area which have a debt to GDP level that's below the 60% threshold. And it's only for, or not only for intergenerational equity reasons, that we need to continue fiscal consolidation.
But the average that you gave, the 97%, masks very big differences between countries. So, Olli Rehn, let's turn to one concrete one, Greece, where there is a lot of discussion about, will Greece need more assistance? If so, of what sort? And should it involve a reduction in debt? What's your take on that?
First on deleveraging, I would broadly agree with Jörg, and in fact supplement him by saying that the fiscal deficits, nominal deficits in the European Union have decreased from the level of 6 to 7% some years ago, 2009, 2010, to around 3% now more recently, which is also a result of the reinforced economic governance we have in Europe, which, by the way, is one reason why our colleague and friend Jeroen Dijsselbloem cannot be here, because he's having budget talks and he's showing responsibility by concluding them and ensuring that the Netherlands will continue with sustainable public finances. And that's also a reason why we have, as we have brought the deficits down, we are now able to do fiscal consolidation with a somewhat slower pace, which takes the short-term impact of that into growth into account. As regards Greece, we know that the debt level of Greece is rather high, and that's the reason why in November last year, almost a year ago, the Eurogroup decided that once Greece has achieved primary fiscal surplus, which it may achieve this year, once Greece has achieved primary budgetary surplus, then the Eurogroup or the Eurozone member states are ready and willing to look into further ways and means of enhancing the debt sustainability of Greece.
What will those further means consist of?
Well, we have actually two kinds of decisions coming concerning Greece. In the rather short term, say around the year end, we have the issues of financing concerning 2014, and then we have the issue of debt sustainability rather once we have seen from the Eurostat data, validated data from Eurostat, that Greece indeed has achieved primary fiscal surplus. And we will have that data next spring for this year, and then we'll have another review mission, and we do our job, we analyze the situation, and together with the ECB and the IMF, we will then make proposals to the Eurozone member states how to deal with the issue of debt sustainability. I always prefer first to establish facts, then do a profound analysis, and only then come to policy conclusions. So it's premature today to come to any conclusion.
Do you think, though, and I'm also going to ask Klaus this, because I think you've made some comments on this before, do you think in principle it is a bad idea to reduce the debt stock? That that's a bad way of reducing the debt burden in the European context? Or do you think it should be part of the discussion as the IMF wants it to be?
Well, we have already had two rounds of private sector involvement concerning Greece when the debt burden of Greece has been very substantially reduced, as for instance the former managing director of the International Institute of Finance, Charles Dallaire, knows well, because he was a negotiator of that. Now we are discussing what further means, ways and means we may have, and personally I do not see that haircuts are neither something that we should aim for or would be reasonable. Rather, I would say that the arsenal will be related to the extension of loan maturities and maybe further reduction of interest rates and some other ways and means. But let's come back to that once we are starting to cross that bridge, which will be sometime in the course of next summer.
Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to open up to questions in just a second, but before I do, one more topic, which is that of reforms in the core countries. We hear a lot in these discussions about what the crisis countries need to do. We hear much less about what kinds of reforms ought to be done in the core countries. And since I have 3 German nationals here, I know you're representing different institutions, but I feel we can have a conversation about Germany. Germany, largest economy, one, and I think you, Olli Rehn, have said it would be helpful if Germany undertook structural reforms that boosted investment. Do you see any sense of that dynamic, that debate within Germany? And how important is it for the future health of the Eurozone that there are reforms in the core countries too? Jörg.
You can make a campaign speech now, so go ahead.
I think Olli and I will give the same answer very likely now. I mean, it's important on substance, but also for the sentiment in Europe that we not only do finger pointing at so-called program countries, what Greece has to do and Portugal has to do. I mean, there are things to do in all Euro area member states, and this includes Germany and France, totally undisputed, I would say. And Germany, if you look back 10 years, it was The Economist who titled The Sick Man of Europe. And at that point in time, Germany was a hopeless case. We were not competitive, we were unable to reform, we had too much manufacturing, it was said. So there were plenty of things that were criticized at that point in time. And then the country was able to reform. I think one can be a bit proud of what entrepreneurs, trade unions, different governments have achieved. But if one does not continue to reform a country, you risk to be the sick man of Europe again 5 to 10 years from now. So there are things Germany needs to do. You can start from, we are underinvested in any kind of infrastructure. We have an issue with the education system. How does one adapt to probably the mega topic of demographic change? There's the issue of energy security. There is the question of how to deal with migration and bring people into the labor market. There's always a question, how do you have a modern tax system? And there's the issue, how do you deal with rising income inequality, which is also negative for reform, for example. So these are, for example, 7 issues where I would see a reform need for Germany.
I'm going to ask you, not as an official EIB position, but simply as someone who clearly follows this closely. You've laid out a to-do list. I think no one would disagree with a to-do list, but isn't there an argument that Germany has become somewhat complacent itself because of its own success now, and that we know what the to-do list is, but I didn't notice very much discussion of any of those topics in the German election campaign?
I think that allegation is completely correct. We run the risk of being too complacent because we have been successful over the last 10 years, but we do not bring out the seeds for being successful for the next 10 years. And when you look at the figures for instance, education, research, development, innovation, that is insufficient in order to really address the global competition of the years and decades to come. If you look at the infrastructure in my country, which is in big parts a shame, then you see that there is big needs to be addressed. So this is no question that this needs to be done. And I think in Germany, but in other countries as well, and some others maybe probably even more right now, it is necessary to also look beyond the present crisis and say, what is expected from us as Europeans once the crisis is over and when we really turn to the real challenges of the global competition. And there, I believe, we still have reform needs practically everywhere in Europe, including the countries who presently believe they are the strongest.
So I fully agree with the 2 previous speakers. I think it's important to remember that economies move in cycles, always. A few years ago, we thought cycles had disappeared, but I think we learned that this was wrong. So economies continue to move in cycles, while public opinion, but also bank analysts, media, sometimes, quite often, just extrapolate short-term trends. So I often hear that Germany will now be permanently strong, and Southern Europe will be permanently weak. And I think this is wrong. In the Commission, there have been many studies done even before the crisis broke in 2008, that economies indeed move in these cycles, or in particular in the monetary union. And you see that also in countries right now, Netherlands, Finland, were very strong. And at the moment, these 2 countries have serious problems, because they're also going through another cycle. And no doubt they will now take measures and become stronger again. There's another turning point. Germany, the last 2 years, has already lost competitiveness. One can see that very clearly in several indicators. And that is not unexpected. People are not aware of it to a large extent in Germany. But it's a normal process that countries that are successful for a while have then higher wage settlements, so they begin to lose competitiveness. Then slowly the current account surplus gets smaller or may go into a deficit, like in the Netherlands. These are normal cyclical developments. What is important, and I think that's one of the important lessons we have drawn from the crisis, is that these cycles, these developments should not become excessive. That's why we created something in Europe that's called excessive imbalance procedure, with the intention of avoiding such excessive imbalances. And that's good to avoid what we saw the last few years. But normal cyclical developments will always be there. And countries that don't reform, it's a permanent task, as Jörg said, they will lose competitiveness compared to those that are reforming. And I take this as a big encouragement for the southern European countries. They are on a good track. There are people like Morgan Stanley, the chief economist of Morgan Stanley, who says Germany and Spain will switch places in the monetary union in the medium term. Not next year. Spain will become the engine of growth in Europe, and Germany is losing competitiveness. I'm not fully agreeing with that, but it's interesting that a serious person from a big bank is taking that view, and it supports this idea that there are always cycles and countries switch their position, and that is particularly important in a monetary union. That's how we function.
The other way that Germany is central now is that clearly Germany is the most important player in determining the direction and pace of all of the broader reforms that we've been discussing. So just as the last question before I open to the floor, Olli Rehn, in the lead up to September 22nd, I heard again and again, things will change after September 22nd. Don't worry, yes, we're all waiting for the German election, but then all kinds of things will move. Well, you know, we're now October. It looks like it's going to be a while before we have clarity about the German government. Is that a problem for you? Is it a problem for the progress in all of these areas that we've discussed? And how long is it going to go on for?
In this sense, German politics and European politics work a bit like the qualifying matches of the European Champions League. You have two legs. You have the first leg, and then you have the second leg. The first leg was the elections. Now the second leg is on, and that's the coalition talks. There is nothing extraordinary in that, and there will be a democratic, politically mandated new government in Germany sometime in the coming weeks, perhaps in the course of November or early December. And that's fine, that's normal. In the meantime, the normal preparatory work goes on. And of course, once certain critical decisions will be taken, then we need that all 28 EU member states have fully politically mandated governments to take those kind of decisions. I'd like to add that to the previous discussion that actually I was very glad to hear the colleagues' expressions and interventions and also concerns and worries because they go to very much to the same direction as the Commission's recommendations to Germany in the recent years. And in fact, Germany and France, we started from the core countries, so-called core countries. Germany and France would do the best service to restoring recovery and reinforcing economic growth in Europe by Germany reinforcing domestic demand and boosting investment, while France undertaking economic reforms that will improve its growth, competitiveness and employment. This would be the best ideal combination which would serve the whole Eurozone and its economic recovery and growth prospects.
Thank you. Let's open the floor now to questions. If you put your hand up, I think there's someone going around with a microphone. Yes, gentleman there, 6 rows back on the left. Could you identify yourself and keep your question reasonably short?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Neil Sandler. I work in international development here in DC. And I'm wondering if another crisis such as the one in Greece would occur within the European Union, would you do anything differently or would you do the same thing? Meaning, would you prescribe the same level of fiscal adjustment, and would you do anything to sort of prevent the enormous social repercussions that Greece faces up to this date? Thank you.
That's a terrific question. What would you do differently? Olli Rehn, you've been there all the way through. Looking back now, and it may not be over, but what would you do differently?
We are all human beings, and we learn in the process of doing. And certainly there are some things that we would do differently. I think it was inevitable that Greece faced a rather front-loaded process of fiscal consolidation in the beginning of the crisis. Why so? Because the public sector in Greece had simply overblown compared to the capacity of the real economy of carrying this overblown public sector, which was a subject of political deals of the both main political parties for 20 or 30 decades, which created a huge public sector. Once the crisis hit, the national economy of Greece simply couldn't carry this public sector anymore. So that was necessary, but at the same time, I would put more emphasis on economic reforms in the early period of the adjustment program, which in fact we had a strong emphasis on structural reforms, but it's much more easier to quantify fiscal targets than economic reforms. And because of the vested interests in Greece and political resistance, these reforms did not advance early enough. And you see, this is a key reason why Greece has only recently started to adjust and is now seeing somewhat better prospects in terms of its economic development.
Jörg, would you have done anything differently, looking back?
I can go along with what Olli said. I mean, it's always easy to, with the knowledge of today, to say what you have maybe done 5 years earlier. And one has to say one hard thing: if a country is close to being insolvent, your policy options are very much limited. Yeah, so there is no alternative for a front-loaded fiscal consolidation. This is harsh, I know this, but what's the alternative? If you have no market access because you have lost it, your debt is nearly deemed to be unsustainable. And on the side of the donors, there is limited willingness to give you more money. Then the policy options are simply limited.
Gentleman here had a question. And you're coming right here in the first row.
Edmond Fondery, former finance minister of France. One of the most difficult questions you have to answer is the return of fragmentation of financial markets. When you look, for example, to the cost of credit of SMEs in Germany or in Spain or Greece, it is much, much higher in peripheral countries. It's a very difficult subject, except the fact that the European Investment Bank is coming to the rescue. What can be done on that problem, the return of this fragmentation due to the euro crisis?
Well, it's Jörg and then Klaus. You clearly, the banking, the stress test is part of it, but is there more that you could do to address this fragmentation?
I mean, if one simply looks at the data, we still have fragmentation, but it has very much decreased compared to its peak, let's say, 12, 14 months ago. If you take these famous target 2 balances as an indicator of fragmentation, they have come down by roughly a third since their peak last year. So fragmentation has decreased, but it's still there. And the banking union is part of removing this. The banking union is good for the internal market because it will further reduce fragmentation. There is an aspect that might remain for some time. The interest rate for SME loans might differ from country to country also because the riskiness of a loan becoming non-performing can be in one subpart of the currency area can be higher than in another one. So one should not expect, even if financial conditions were to become perfect, that interest rates would be the same.
Yes, gentleman through back, Alessandro.
I'm Alessandro Laipo of the Lisbon Council. I wanted to ask the panel for clarification on fiscal adjustment and specifically on what matters. Is it the nominal fiscal deficit or is it the structural adjustment? Because in the public discourse and in peer pressure, it's always the holy grail of the 3% of GDP, the nominal target. But in economic common sense, and even a lot of the texts underlying the Stability and Growth Pact, one speaks of structural adjustment, the underlying adjustment corrected for cyclical effects and one-off measures. And I have my country, Italy, for example, in mind. Most forecasts think that the deficit this year will be 3.2% of the GDP. Do they really have to take additional measures for those 2 decimal points? Low quality measures probably in the circumstances when they're still achieving their structural balance target.
Olli Rehn, I think this is to you. So the Commission does try to have it both ways on this. Do you focus on the structural, or do you still focus on the nominal?
We focus on both.
Okay.
But the structural balance is more important of these two. At the same time, it is often subject to, say, statistical and policy uncertainties. So we cannot completely discard the importance of the nominal target either. But in principle, and in line with, I would say, consensus in economic theory and economics profession, it makes sense to focus on the structural sustainability of public finances over the medium term, rather than only on the short-term targets, short-term fiscal adjustment. But at the same time, it's important to note that if you design an ideal policy of fiscal adjustment and you have ideal circumstances, which you don't in most of the cases have, then you do it usually so that you first have a somewhat smoother and slower pace of adjustment while you take sturdy measures over the medium term, so you have least negative impact on short-term economic growth, while at the same time you try to ensure the sustainability over the medium to long term. That's what, for instance, the IMF has recommended to the United States. But it's very difficult here because there is, as we know, precisely not an agreement.
I'm not sure I would take the US as a poster child for how to do this.
Well, it's a certain kind of reference, let's put it that way. In Europe, we have, since last 2 years, in fact, since the end of 2011, we have been recommending a slower pace of adjustment and focusing much more on the structural deficits. In the beginning of the debt crisis in 2010 and 11, it was not simply possible, mostly for the reasons which Jörg underlined. And there is now a major difference, major qualitative change since, I would say, end 2011, early 2012, for 3 reasons. First, an enhanced credibility of fiscal policy in the euro area member states. Second, the decisive action of the European Central Bank to stabilize financial and bond markets. And third, the reinforced economic governance, which provides a medium-term framework for fiscal adjustment and advancing structural reforms. For these reasons, also the political crisis in Greece or Portugal or Italy in the recent half-year period did not shake the foundations of the Eurozone like they did 2 or 3 years ago, because the Eurozone is, the foundations of the Eurozone are clearly much more solid and sturdier today than, say, 2 years ago.
Thank you. There are several questions here, and I was going to say, lady here in the second row.
Thank you. I'm Katerina Soko with Greek Daily Kathimerini. I would actually would like to follow up on what you said about the political, possible political backlash in the countries of Southern Europe, given the economic hardship that these countries have been experiencing and the really high, unacceptably high for European countries, unemployment levels. So the question is, there is this recent publication by the Bertelsmann Foundation on the lessons of a debt crisis and surviving it, given the examples and from Latin America. And it warns actually policymakers to focus on the political backlash, the danger of a political backlash to reform and reform fatigue. So how do you address that in the Commission and in the Eurogroups when you're taking decisions on Greece? Thank you.
Thank you. How do you address the risk of political backlash?
I'm painfully aware of the social consequences of the finance and debt crisis in Southern Europe as well as in many other parts of Europe. And to my mind, that should serve as a very strong encouragement to counter this crisis, end the crisis, restore recovery, and restore economic growth so that we have solid foundations for job creation and improving of welfare of our citizens in Southern Europe as well as elsewhere in Europe.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions and we have a very hard deadline of 4:15. So yes, gentlemen there, 5 back, right here. And yes, I saw the other one next. We'll try and get through to all of them.
Real quick, Robert Schroeder, international investor. We've seen the adoption of a financial transaction tax in Europe, or its consideration. What's the prospect of such a tax being dedicated to some sort of insurance fund that would assist in crises in the future?
Thank you. Who wants to take that? I guess, Olli, it's you again.
We have, as you know, we have an ongoing deliberation on a financial transaction tax in Europe. And latest I saw today, I flew yesterday in Washington, so I saw a report from Berlin where the SPD has raised the FTT, the financial transaction tax, as a condition for moving towards a common resolution fund in the context of the banking union in Europe. You see that it's a very lively debate and there are different options being considered. But I think something I want to say to this audience is that it is a very serious proposal, and the Eurozone countries are very serious about this option of moving forward with a financial transaction tax.
Just briefly, is it a good idea?
The Commission has made a proposal on this about a year ago, and we defend our proposal.
Okay, gentleman here. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to get to all these questions, but we'll try as many as we can.
My name is Tom Ellis. I'm from Kathimerini, the same paper from Greece. All of us would agree that the IMF has the expertise on dealing with debt, I think, all these decades.
Can you speak to the mic, please?
All of us would agree that the IMF has the expertise dealing with debt. And they are calling openly in analysis, and even Mrs. Lagarde, for a haircut on the Greek debt. Are they missing something? Do they have it wrong?
Thank you. I don't mean to cut you off, but let's get as many as we can. Klaus, you've said it's a very bad idea. Why? Why is the IMF wrong?
I didn't say it's a bad idea.
You did.
You're right, the IMF focuses on debt. They have their framework, which has been applied in many, many countries around the world the last 30 years or so. They have mainly a 10-year horizon because the IMF lends for 10 years and they want to get their money out, so they are right to focus on a 10-year horizon. We have, for Greece, a 30-year time horizon. So it's a different time horizon. And I've pointed out that we have done a lot which provides a big grant element to Greece by financing at very low interest rates. The interest rates the EFSF and ESM charge on borrowing countries is only half as high as the IMF interest rate. So we have longer maturities, lower interest rates. We have done, in the case of Greece, interest rate deferral. When you add all that up, it's economically like a haircut. That's important to keep in mind. So what I've said is not enough to focus on one number, where 10 years from now the debt ratios. One also has to look at what interest rates this is financed and what is the other support that countries are giving.
Thank you. Jörg, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, maybe to sharpen the argument, the fund, when they do this kind of analysis and suggestion, they are just talking about other people's money, because the fund has a clearly preferred creditor status, and they suggest that other creditors of the country do something on their side. These are the member states of the euro area, but the fund's money, it's surely shielded. So one should add this to give a complete picture.
Thank you. Gentleman there, 7 rows back.
Hi, I'm Nick Parikh from the State Department. The markets were soothed by the promise of OMT. The German Constitutional Court is about to rule on the constitutionality of that OMT process. Are there contingency plans in the event that it is ruled unconstitutional? Thanks.
This is one for you. You were there.
Yeah, that was a very pleasant event, yes. I mean, I have no idea when they're going to rule, what they're going to rule. We are deeply convinced that on economic reason it was necessary to do the OMT, that on legal grounds it was possible to do it. We were acting within our mandate, and that the result was highly efficient. That's all that we're going to say. The OMT is there. It can be activated if necessary. This is what markets needs to know.
But presumably, European actors must have contingency plans in case they rule the other way.
As I said, I'm not going to speculate what they're going to rule. We are always prepared, but the OMT is there, and it will be there.
Thank you. Yes, gentleman here. You're not from Greece. This is the Greek contingent
It's
here.
the Greek department.
Okay, very quick.
Argyris Papastathis στο Βήμα from Mr. Regling. Do you think that we should have another program for Greece? Do you think that the IMF should be a part of this program? And does the ESM have the capacity or will develop the capacity and the expertise to monitor a program like that and replace the IMF?
Okay. Should the IMF be part of another program, or could you take its place?
Well, that the IMF has to say whether they can be part of another program. The general expectation in markets is that there will be another program, because the likelihood that Greece can return to the markets next year, the middle of next year when the current program expires, so that they can return and finance themselves completely in the market is not very high. If we are pleasantly surprised, all the better, but it's not a high probability. That's why the general expectation is that a third program is probably needed. One should not have 100% certainty, because it still runs another 9 months. But it seems to me likely that this may happen. And in my expectation, it will be very much like the previous programs, with long maturities, low interest rates.
Thank you. Gentleman here, you've been very patient.
Thank you. I'm not Greek either.
You're not Greek?
I'm not Greek.
I have nothing against Greek questions. We've just had a lot of them.
It's Rob Colorina, AIEC Investment. It's a softer question, more towards the EIB. If you could just reflect a little bit on lessons learned from your development areas there that you might have taken back into your, from the developing areas to the developed areas, I'd be curious to that input.
Well, that's hard to say. Of course, we are learning everywhere, and we are learning in the non-EU countries where we do loans as well. However, the transfer of immediate knowledge from there to the EU business is a little bit difficult, because we are there in a development context, which we are not in the European Union. So it is really hard to say. But I think in general, let me put it that way, for us it's extremely helpful to gain experience in non-European countries. This is why I insist also that we convince our shareholders that it makes sense to be active in the non-European countries, although the immediate problems in the European Union are burning enough. But we need to further develop this global outlook of the Europeans. And there the bank can be helpful. And that, of course, translates also into a more international approach in our own intra-EU lending.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Hello, Peter Meyer, Models & Company. Following the adjustments too, and in the banking sector, what we see is that corporate lending, we see that now moving from the banking sector towards capital markets, and alternative markets. Is that something that makes you happy, or something that makes you scared?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Is the shift away from bank lending towards capital markets, informal capital markets, a good thing?
I mean, the shift, when you look at Europe, is not really taking place. I mean, it's still roughly that our financial system is 75% bank-based. That is very different.
And that's the problem. That's the problem.
And that's very different to the US. So there are no difficulties if capital markets, especially a single capital markets, is further developed. What could be a matter of concern if one, due to tougher but necessary regulation of the banking sector, shifts similar activities as banking activities to the so-called shadow banking sector. This is a different issue. new entities, new market participants try to avoid regulation. This is an issue where the FSB and the G20 are looking at, and this is probably the biggest regulatory thing we have in front of us for the next 5 years.
I think I was going to ask one more question, but I have a feeling you have a very hard deadline. I think we are going to have to leave it there. I know many of you didn't get your questions answered. I'm so sorry. Thank you all for a fantastic discussion. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much.